Welcome to In Conversation at St. Peter's here with Alastair McIntosh and David Robertson. And thanks so much for coming out on a cold January night. It's really good to see you. My name's Crawford Mackenzie, and it's my privilege and honour and my scary responsibility of facilitating this conversation between these two gentlemen. I was almost going to say gentle giants, that might be what it is, but certainly it's one of the best. Being in this place here is one of the best laxatives I know. So, Alastair described this as a conversation across the garden fence, and I always thought of rigging up a little garden fence there, but we'll do with a fireside chat. We will have, after the conversation, we'll have a Q&A time for an opportunity to ask some questions, and also stay around afterwards to chat. There's no rush away. I think 11 o'clock might be the last calling point. Anyway, so a welcome to you both.
Thank you.
And I've got a cheek introducing you. But for those of you who don't know, Alastair is a human ecologist and an activist, and he led various campaigns to stop the scavenging of a mountain in Harris for a super quarry, but also for the purchase, the buyout, the local buyout of the island of Egg, which is particularly interesting to me because Egg was where I grew up, and in the time of when Lord Runciman was the laird. I don't know whether he was a good laird or not, but
I think he was much loved.
Really?
He was much loved,
right,
and he wrote his 3-volume History of the Crusades, right, which is, I believe, still considered the unsurpassed history, right, of that epoch of history.
Right. Yeah. So well, and there maybe weren't such good landlords after that, but it's wonderful that the people there actually own the island, and it's a wonderful place to visit. And Alastair is also a Quaker and the author of several books, including Soil and Soul and Poacher's Pilgrimage.
That would be something.
He's upgraded me already.
Yeah. And it's a fascinating, if you haven't read it, it's a fascinating account of a 12-day trip round the western edge, really, of the Outer Hebrides through Harris and Lewis, and beautifully describing. You describe it in the dramatic present tense, and that gives you the feeling that you're journeying, that you're doing the journeying with you, and all the intertwining of all the wildlife and the geology and the history and the artifacts and of course with the people themselves, and then all the musings on faith and the Bible and war and violence and all these things. It's a fascinating book, and it's at the back there. Do get a chance to read it. And David is, I'm a bit ridiculous introducing you, but David is the minister of St. Peter's here, and has been for the last 27 years. Mm-hmm. And during that time, the congregation was barely a dozen or so, and is now in the hundreds, 400s or so here. And he's a debater and a broadcaster and a prolific blogger. I actually hate that word. It's horrible.
It's a horrible word, it is, yeah.
But that's what that is. And co-founded SOLAS, the Centre for Public Christianity.
If he's John Bunyan, can I be John Calvin?
I knew it. I could see you coming.
Yeah. But David's also the author of several books, including The Dawkins Delusions and Magnificent Obsession. And you don't know this, but I had one of these bizarre conversations with David in the car when I was travelling over to the west coast to Sana, to a site visit one day when he called me, and I wasn't driving, by the way. And he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually in Kilchoan, in Armagh." And he said, "Oh, that was where I preached my first sermon." Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
In the Free Church in Kilchoan, just up from the village. What you didn't know was Cajon was where I preached my first sermon in the Church of Scotland, in the village. And it was something that happened purely by accident. It was they were scraping the bottom of the barrel, and they just said, "Can you preach?" And so I was landed in this job. And I climbed up the stairs into the pulpit, and the first thing I did was threw my notes over onto the and it went downhill from there. Right at the end of the service, I was told to go to the door to meet people, and the First Lady came out and she said, shook my hands and said, "Thank you." She said, "I really enjoyed your sermon." And then she said, no, I didn't. I didn't like it at all, actually. But she said, "I loved your choice of hymns."
There you go.
The hymns were chosen by the organist. I think the message was there: stick to architecture. So anyway, enough of my musings and my stories. It's not about me. I'm simply trying to be a facilitator for these gentlemen to speak. And I just wondered if I could set the ball rolling by asking you, Alastair. Having read a Poacher's Pilgrimage, there seems to be a tension there, a creative tension. I mean, I think that's probably what makes it particularly interesting, in which you see you have difficulty with it. You see the Highland Church, the Calvinist, the Presbyterian, hardline, as you would describe it. Maybe these are all very loaded terms, but very problematic. And on the other hand, finding the people with a warmth and a humanity, and having a real affection and love for them, people who would stand on that ground, as it were. And I wondered if that's how you resolve that. If it is in fact a tension, or how you resolve. Are you willing to comment on that?
I think that Jesus is all in the heart. The realm of heaven is all around, is within. We're called to let go of our hearts of stone and be invited into the living heart that is the heart of God. And so on occasions when people describe me as a theologian, amongst various other titles, I like to qualify it by saying, a fake theologian, which I'm sure David would understand why. Donny Foot would certainly probably agree with that description.
Right.
Because I think that when we do theology, when we talk about confessions of faith, creeds, and what have you, when we talk about systematic theology, we are entering into the realm of the human intellect, into the head, which is hugely important, because if we don't go there, we can get pulled down directions that are irrational, that are cultic. But if we get stuck there, if we don't enter into the heart, we fall prey to the very criticisms that, according to the Gospels, Jesus levelled against the Pharisees and such groups who are into a narrow legalism. So for me, the intellectual side, debating the Westminster Confession of Faith or whatever might be appropriate, or in the Quaker movement, our lack of any such creedal doctrine, is exciting and it's important, but it's not that important. The really important thing is to remember, love God and love one another, and then all else can take place on that platform.
But did it not surprise you that what you might describe as a very hard edge theology thing seemed to produce kind of people who are lovely almost? That was what was meaning.
Well, that was, I grew up in Lewis. I wasn't born in Lewis.
Right.
My father is Scottish, and as a young doctor graduating from Edinburgh was Highland ancestors. My twice great-grandfather was Murdo MacLennan of Contin, who was one of the great presenters in the Free Church. Joseph Mainzer wrote down his Free Church tunes, his Gaelic tunes.
Okay.
On the Highland side, and on the border side of my father, we're reputedly linked into Thomas Boston's family. My father went down, my father having been raised in one of the Brethren schools. I think, does that make sense? Gladstone?
The Glanton.
Glanton, thank you. They were Glanton Brethren.
So was my father.
No.
Yeah. I was brought up in the Glanton Brethren.
No.
Yes.
Well, my aunties died Glanton Brethren.
So what's Glanton, brethren?
Glanton Brethren were the really strict brethren. But I knew them as actually a very loving community. But there were things, yes, that, women didn't speak, you wore hats. That's it, the women wore hats and so on. So you see, we're going to find a lot in common here.
This is dangerous.
It's very dangerous. I've got your membership application. I've got my elders all ready for you, Alastair.
I mean, I expected the wee flea's bite. I didn't expect a kiss to start things off with. That's really... So, I mean, my grandparents and aunties, they used to go to the schoolhouse in Morningside.
My parents were married there.
Oh, goodness.
My earliest memory, one of my earliest memories outside of the Church of Scotland, in which I was raised, and the Free Church, which we would often be part of because it was a community growing up in Lewis. One of my earliest memories was going along to the schoolhouse, being taken along by my Auntie Ellen, who was a matron in Simpson's maternity, and being really surprised that they seemed to have no ministers, but just a member of the congregation, male, would stand up and testify. And the next time that I encountered any such thing was when I encountered the Quakers. Because that's what we do in the Quakers. We don't have clergy. Yeah. Each one of us is called to step into the role of ministry, if so moved by the Spirit, and then to step back out of it into being an ordinary member of the body of the Kirk. Well, that was my father's background, you see. And he, as you say, it was very strict. He became Church of Scotland, and we were raised in that context. My mother was English, you see, and I was born in Doncaster because my father, the young doctor, after the Second World War, went down to get his first job in the Doncaster Royal Infirmary, where my mother was a nursing sister and had nothing to do with any church. So I basically came from that family background. Aged 4, 1960, moving to Lewis because my father was desperate to get back to Scotland, and then basically being raised in what was predominantly a free church community with some Church of Scotland, a few FPs. Now you don't know where you stand because there's so many schisms, but it's primarily still a free church community. And when you're growing up in it, you don't realise what you are being given. But it's only when you go away. In my case, when I was 22, I got posted by voluntary service overseas to Papua New Guinea. And of all things, David, I was sent to a Catholic mission. And my goodness, they were lovely people too. And, they were unpacking Vatican II and liberation theology. So that had a big impact on me. And it wasn't until much later, coming back to Lewis, and growing up, we would always talk about getting out of the dump. What do you want to do when you leave school? I want to get out of the dump. Because in those days, you couldn't travel so easily as you could now. And it's kind of like I went back to the dump and found treasure there. And increasingly, part of that treasure has been the spiritual treasures. There is nothing I like. When I go back home to Lewis to visit my old mother, who's sorry, she said not to call her old mother, she had called her my elderly mother, just in case she happens to watch this on YouTube.
Right, okay.
My elderly mother.
Right.
When I do that, nothing I like more than going and sitting with the old Caliots and Buddhas and talking about their spirituality, even though our theology is so different.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know
but
that.
it's in the heart. They're full of heart.
Yeah, For
They're
those of you
full
who
of
don't know
heart.
for those of you who don't know, that's old men and old women.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry. The old men and old women. The old board buttocks and Callies. Yes.
And was it really called the dump? Did you refer?
Well,
to
that's
the dump?
what we used to say in the Nicholson. I'm talking now in the 1960s and 70s. It was just the way that kids, every rural kid or kind of rural area, you always want to get out of your own area and see the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's been the pattern on Lewis. The young men would go off to sea or to the army or whatever, and then they would come back and they would marry late. That's why the IRA was such a disaster, because it wiped out that generation. And Mary Ann MacLeod, who became Mrs. Donald Trump, her generation, although she was only, she was born in 1918, she emigrated in 1930. Yeah. So, although she was only born in 1918, it was actually the tranche of men that she would have married who had been drowned in the Ireland, and 1 in 5 of them killed, say 1 in 6 of them killed in the trenches.
Yeah.
So, goodness, you see how expansive this gets.
But let me disappoint you a little bit, because it's another thing we have in common. My father moved south because of his work. He was a farm labourer. So I was born in England as well.
Aha!
And my mother was a nursing sister too.
Wow.
So, but this is really going to get you. The old schoolhouse, do you know what it is now?
Probably a pub or something, is it?
A free church.
No.
Yes.
Is that Annabelle, I'm seeing?
That's Annabelle, yes. Annabelle's the reason you're here, isn't it?
She's the umpire. Your job is to preside over the proceedings. But if fighting breaks out, Annabelle's to be the one that comes out and separates us. That's amazing. So it's now a free church.
Right.
Yeah, it's now a free
I'll tell you,
church.
those old brethren, they would love that.
Yeah. Well, do you know another really, really interesting thing in terms of what you were saying? Can I push this just a little bit? Going back to, God in your heart and all the rest of it, right? I totally agree. It was a Welsh preacher, Martin Lloyd-Jones, who said that he despaired of a Christianity which went straight for the heart, and he was really talking about American evangelicalism. And he said, really, God goes for your heart, but he gets to your heart through your head. And that idea, for me, it's very, very important. When we're talking about believing in Jesus, it's asking, well, who is Jesus? And theology, for me, is not about arguing angels dancing on pinheads. It's just answering the question, who is Jesus? And discussing that, and what does he want us to do? My view would be that everyone has theology, in the sense of philosophy, at least, the philosophy of life. And it's what they base it on. And I think that's what I loved your book, because I thought you were very generous in it, and genuinely so, not patronizingly so. And I also, it's beautifully written. That's the first thing for a writer. And it's readable, which is even better for the reader. But for me, what came over was the warmth and your honesty about people that you disagreed with on some fundamentals. It really, I would highly recommend this book, and I'm not saying that because you're here. I have recommended it.
Well, I was able to do that, David, because of the warmth that I received. And in setting out to do this pilgrimage, the reason I called it Poacher's Pilgrimage is that I was vexed with the question, in the Presbyterian Hebrides, you don't do things like pilgrimage. These were, when we were growing up, these were what would be described as, forgive me, papist superstitions.
Yes.
That was the term that was used in those days, because you've got to remember, in those days, the Southern Hebrides, which were Catholic, were in mental space further away than Africa was. At least we got missionaries coming from Africa. Yeah. In my entire childhood, in fact, it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I met a Southern Hebridean, an Isle of Barrow, South Uist Catholic. That's how separated we were, with them being part of Inverness and we were Ross and Cromarty. There just wasn't the connection. So, I've lost my thread there. But basically what was happening is that walking through the island, that's right, walking through the island, I felt called to make a pilgrimage. I felt called to not just do a walk, but do a walk with intent. Yeah. A walk that would be about spiritual reflection. So I started off in the south of Harris and went up to the Bays area of Harris for 2 days. And then 4 days out over the moors between Harris and Uig, coming out at the Grimace, just near Garnaheim there. But I say 4 days, but I'm going like this kind of all the way, going very, very slowly and meditatively. And then the remainder of the remaining 6 days or whatever it was, up through the villages of the west coast. Now what should happen? But just the way the timing went, because as I was going, I really wasn't sure what route I was going to take. It was going to depend on terrain and so on. I had sort of going right up the spine of the island and avoiding the villages, not getting drawn into social discourse. But the way it worked out, I ended up coming out at Garnaheim there. And that was on the Saturday. And I thought, my goodness, the problem with this is that it's one thing for tourists, or tourists as we would say, to go walking through the villages on the Sabbath with a rucksack on your back. But if you're from the place, you don't do that. It would be like walking through somebody's front garden or something like that. So I thought I'd maybe best take it easy. So I checked into a B&B. I went along to the Calvinistic stones there to do a bit of worshipping there, David. And then...
Yes, I know. I hitchhiked there once and I just went for shelter.
And I went into the Colony Centre. I said to you, can you find me a B&B? They were really helpful. They got me the last room in the Loch Road guest house. And I was sitting there, eating my kippers on a Sunday morning. And I thought, there's no Quaker meeting around here and something like that. The only thing within walking distance is the Free Church. And I thought, oh no, not the Free Church.
Remember this is a free church, remember?
Sorry?
Remember, you're in a free church.
I'm telling you honestly what was in my mind, It was kind of, I don't want all that fundamentalist Calvinistic stuff. Yeah. I'm in a different space. And then I thought to myself, I remembered a Buddhist nun, Sister Kandasiri, who's got a wee nunnery, part of a wee nunnery of a conservative Buddhist group, Theravada Buddhist group. They're just outside Cymru. And I remember, in my mind, Sister Kandasiri sort of saying to me, I said to her, how do you get on with the, Theravada Buddhists, how do you get on with them when they're so, I said, they're the Free Church of Buddhism. And she said, I know, but I've been with them 20 years and they are such lovely people. And I thought to myself, why am I judging the Free Church like this? Because I've been raised by these people and they're such lovely people. I just don't agree with some of their theology. So I went along and Callum MacDonald, Kai, was working his way through Job. And he's into Job 12. Mm-hmm. And it's, the tabernacles of the robbers prosper. But I say unto thee, ask of the birds of the air, inquire of the beasts of the field, demand of the earth itself, and they shall proclaim unto thee that the Lord thy God holds all of this in his hand. Mm-hmm. And he proceeded. I have encountered clergy who avoid such passages because they're frightened of pantheism. Mm-hmm. But he understood that this was panentheism, God in nature, God present in the creation. Yeah. He proceeded to unfold a sermon that talked about all the political shenanigans and climate change and so on. It was so mind-blowing. I took out my notebook and started writing notes. And then he and Margaret invited me round to lunch with the elders afterwards. And it was just such warmth, you see. So that got me thinking, I had to address that in this book. Yeah. I had to address this question of, I don't think of myself as an evangelical, certainly not a conservative evangelical, in the way that some in this church, perhaps all in this church, I don't know, might do. But there is a depth of heart that is just a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, that's...
I'm quite wary of labels for lots and lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
So everything that you're saying there, I empathize with and agree with, and I hear that hospitality, teaching the Bible, that impacted upon you and was really, really important. I think one of the problems with the labels is you then kind of judge people and say, well, do they fit within this label? My argument would be that one of the reasons the churches have declined in Scotland is because they've gone after the labels of various kinds. They followed the society and not sought to follow Christ, and it's the Christ of the Bible. You know, because words, and especially in a postmodern society, I mean, you use words beautifully, but in a postmodern society, words can often become meaningless because they just mean whatever I want them to mean. And for me, the word Jesus Christ, it means something.
Yeah.
But I think what you identified with there was, it's an old tradition within the Free Church and within the Scottish Church, which is the radicalism of the Bible.
You bet.
You know,
I call it liberation theology.
So, for example, this church never had a squire's pew.
That's interesting.
Never.
In contrast with Egg, which is full of squares pews.
So when this church,
it's not my fault.
It's not your fault, but I mean it's very interesting to go into the Church of Egg. You know, you see the social class system laid out.
And if you go to some of the southern,
common thing.
If you go to some of the southern churches in the US, you know, the upstairs was where the blacks, the slaves went, and the downstairs. Now, in the Free Church from 1843 onwards, largely because the Free Church, it was in the cities, but in the Highlands it was the poorer people as well. There was just this whole attitude. And you said, you know, Poacher's Pilgrimage. I remember there was an elder in Lewis Estate near. I mean, I married a girl from Lewis, so I'm getting close to you. He stayed in the same area, and he was an elder in the Stornoway Free Church. And he used to go out poaching.
Of course,
on the sea.
It's not a sin.
And I remember asking him about it. You know, is this not, like, you're an elder, an upstanding member, is this not illegal? And he quoted the Psalms, the earth belongs unto the Lord and all that it contains.
Except, of course, the Western Isles belonging to McBride.
That's right. But I just, you know, bizarrely, that's what initially drew me to the Free Church, because I was in a Baptist church in Edinburgh, and I love the Baptists as well, but I was in Edinburgh in a Baptist church. And some of it was very triumphalist. And I remember I went to a Free Church youth fellowship, and I loved it because I thought they were all so miserable, and I could do with it. And I wanted a bit of misery. What they were doing was they were sitting around talking. I mean, if you said liberation theology, they would say no chance. And most wouldn't know what it was. But what were they talking about then? They were talking about unemployment.
They're doing liberation theology.
But they wouldn't see it that way. And what I liked about the Free Church, and I think I would say that not just the Scottish church, but the church throughout the world, when it's remained faithful to the scriptures, it's always been radical. Not pretend radical, not what I call middle class radical, that virtue signaling radical, but really radical.
No, it's been with the people.
Yes,
it's been
always.
It's been with the people, and you know, in Poacher's Pilgrimage, I've woven through loads of stories that testify to that truth, like the story about the time of tuberculosis, and the woman was at home with a daughter who was dying of the TB, and they've not got any money. The daughter's crying out for food, and the mother says, "My darling daughter, I haven't got a scrap of food in the house to give you." And then she sees this man walking along the road, and he goes past the house, and then he traces back his steps and comes up to the house, knocks on the door, and says, "There is £1. The Lord told me to give it to you." And the beauty of that story is that he was relieving her of any burden of expectation to repay it. You know, and the place is full of that. Can I just say, on the Poacher's Pilgrimage, the way I resolved this business of going through on a pilgrimage, and what was I going to say to people who knew me, who would say, "What are you doing, Alastair?" is that I had a fishing rod with me. And so I'd say to them, "I'm on a pilgrimage from loch to loch, having a wee cast. I'm on a poacher's pilgrimage." And because poaching is not a sin, and no less an authority than Professor MacLeod has said so in his column in the Westfield Island Free Press in the days, because that is the case, you can have your pilgrimage so long as you are only fishers. We will leave it as the moot question as to whether we are talking about fishers of fish or fishers of men. I understand Jesus did both.
Yeah.
But David, can we move to points of disagreement? Because we're
It's
getting
okay.
on much too well.
Yes, okay.
I know it's getting a bit too pally here. So. What about the Bible then?
What would you like to raise?
Well, Calvinism.
Okay.
So let me say why. Because I've been talking about the upside of the Highland Church, if we can use that as a general catch-all for Highland Presbyterianism. I've been talking about the upside of it, and the side which to me is the side that matters. Okay? The downside, as I've at times experienced it, has been a theology that teaches double predestination, and with that, limited atonement. So I know there's a few people here tonight who won't be familiar with these terms.
Yes.
If I could just give
Yeah.
my own understanding of those terms, and you can then put me right in the matter. Double predestination arises out of the Calvinist, or John Calvin's, insistence that the most important thing is the sovereignty of God. Or as in that passage from Job 12 that I paraphrased earlier, the Lord God holdeth all this in her hand. Because we are created male and female in the likeness of God. So now and again I swap gender in order to just remind ourselves we are not just talking about a patriarchy here. God holds all of this in God's hand. And to Calvin, that understanding is, in my view, quite rightly supreme. Calvin then reasons from that because God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, God has foresight of everything. And so when God created humankind, because hell, in this way of approaching theology, because hell is a literal reality, and we can come to this point, because hell is a reality and heaven is a reality, some must be destined for heaven, namely the elect, and others destined for hell, namely the damned, or as the Westminster Confession of Faith puts it, the Lord passeth them by, or words to that effect. Then following on from that, the question is that if God, before the foundations of the earth were laid, predestined some souls to be created for hell, and this is, in a particular take on Calvinism, which not all Calvinists would agree with, but in the take that we quite often had when we were growing up. Because of that, Christ is only effective for the elect, or as the American punk singer Patti Smith puts it, Jesus died for someone's sins, but not mine. Why? Because if God has already decided who's going to hell, Jesus would be wasting Jesus' time trying to save them from hell. And this is called the doctrine of limited atonement, that salvation is limited to the elect but not the damned. Now, I don't know whether you believe that, David, or if you believe it like that, but I'm taking my anchor points from certain statements in Calvin's Institutes, and as they have come through to us in the Westminster Confession of Faith as a subordinate standard of the Church of Scotland that I was raised in, and also of this church here. And to me, that's a profoundly problematic theology. The idea that God, as Calvin puts it, is armed for vengeance, quote, Book 2, Chapter 16 of the Institutes, armed for vengeance, and requires that kind of vengeance for human sin, doesn't fit with my understanding that God is love.
Okay.
And so that's really the theological difference.
Okay.
David.
Right. Your 9 o'clock train, forget that.
You really ought to have been in St. Peter's here in the last few weeks because
because I've just preached a series of sermons through Romans 9. So that will set you right if you go and listen to them. But it will take about 6 hours, so I'm not going to do it here. And just a couple of things, Alastair, and then maybe the particular things I do want to.
Forgive me if I boxed you in there.
No. Well, you haven't actually, except this. I genuinely do mean that you've gone into something that's incredibly deep, and that to get the whole background to it and to do it properly was. So thank you for raising the question. Double predestination is not taught by Calvin, nor is it held in the confession. It's a double predestination is the idea God says, right, I'm creating this one for heaven and this one for hell. And what Calvin taught, and also I think what's in Romans, what Paul taught, also what Jesus taught, you did not choose me, but I chose you, is that people are saved because of God choosing them, but people are lost because they choose hell. So although C.S. Lewis hated Calvinism, he actually taught the same thing. Because the bottom line is nobody is in hell who didn't choose to go there.
Could I just catch you there? Did you say they chose?
Yes.
So have we got free will?
Yes.
Some Calvinists would disagree with you.
Yes, but they would. Well, so would some Lutherans. So Martin Luther wrote a book called Bondage of the Will.
Yeah.
And of course, we don't have absolute free will. The vast majority of atheists, Richard Dawkins included, do not believe in free will at all.
Yeah, they're determinists.
They're genetic determinists.
Yeah.
What we would do is we would believe that God created us with free will so that we are responsible, but that our will is not sovereign. We can't determine everything, but we are responsible for what we do. So one of the very simple things is you would find a Calvinist like W.G.T. Shedd, he believes the vast majority of people are in heaven because he believes that every child who dies in infancy goes to heaven because they haven't had the ability yet to sin of their own free will. And he believed that the atonement included original sin, all children born. So, and I would actually hold to that view as well myself. However, the thing about the sovereignty of God, Calvin's great concern was not the sovereignty of God, but rather that he made a statement once: the two hardest things to know in the world are yourself and God. How can you know? He would argue, and I would argue this completely, we know through the scriptures. So what do the scriptures teach all the time? That's how we learn about Jesus. That's how we do that. Now, the sovereignty of God, you mentioned the Alastair. What I find fascinating about the Alastair, there was a program recently, I'm sure you saw it.
Can you just explain what? In case
the Alastair was the boat that sank, and
1919,
1919,
200 odd,
216, I think, died or something.
Coming home from
the war, yeah, and I mean, it's interesting that that's mentioned as a great tragedy, but there were 6,000 men from Lewis in a population of 29,000. 1/3 of whom died. 2,000 died in the war, which for me is the greater tragedy. But nonetheless, that's a huge tragedy. But 3 women were being interviewed, and afterwards a clinical psychologist made the comment, it was their faith that sustained them.
You bet, yeah.
And I think that strong faith in the sovereignty of God stopped them going mad. And I would argue that the sovereignty of God is, Calvin's idea about it was a doctrine of comfort for God's people, not a doctrine of torment. And I think the way that
is an important point.
I have a sympathy with you, because I think the way it's often been taught is as a doctrine of torment. Are you chosen? Are you one of the elect? That's not a question you ask. The question you ask is, what do you think of Christ? And then you work it from there. But can I come? The one I really want to go with, I go at you at, and I really disagree, because this
just to say, I like what you said there. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, you see, I mean, if God is not sovereign, I'm stuffed. That's my bottom line.
Okay.
If God, I mean, this is what God's sovereignty means. Forgive me for being a little bit personal, but I've been thinking about this a lot. In 2011, I almost died, and when I was in hospital and I was in a coma, they flew my daughter over from Australia because they thought I was dying.
Wow.
And my son went to collect her. He came to the hospital. I don't remember any of this. But he posted on Facebook afterwards, I've been with my sister to see my dad, possibly for the last time. We're praying that he gets better. But if he doesn't get better, our prayers have already been answered because my dad's greatest problem, his sin, has already been dealt with. So if my dad dies, if my dad's healed, that's an answer to prayer. If he dies, that's an answer to prayer. Now, that's easy to write in a theology exam. It's not so easy to write when you've been at the deathbed that you perceive of your father. When I gave that at a British council meeting up in Caithness, it was the first meeting I spoke at, the scientist I was discussing with shouted out at me, "That's not fair. That means that God wins, whatever." And I said, "You got it." That's the sovereignty of God. Jesus always wins. It's not, I wonder if, what would Jesus do about this? That would be my argument. And that's why this thing about armed for vengeance, here's what I think about that. And that is such a comfort. I'll tell you how. You go to Argyle, and in the old church in Argyle, when the people were being cleared off the land, you will see their names etched in the windows.
Yeah. Croik Church.
Where is that
In
church?
Croik Church, in Argyle, up in Sutherland. Now, you read someone like Hugh Miller. One of the things that sustained these people was that God saw their suffering and that God would punish those. So they didn't revolt. They didn't try and create a revolution. There was a wee Crofters rebellion on Skye once. But that wasn't fatalism. That wasn't, I think in some it may have been, it wasn't, whatever will be, will be. It was, God is just, God is fair, God will deal with this. We are not going to respond violently. Now, you would appreciate that as a Quaker.
Yes, but where I question there is, what do you mean by God would punish?
I mean that where there is evil, where there is injustice, where there is wrong, God will put it right.
That's justice. I wouldn't call that punishment.
Well, if you have punishment without justice, it's wrong.
If you have punishment without justice, it's wrong. But why do you need the punishment?
Because you won't have justice without it.
How not? Why do you need... You can have justice with forgiveness and no need for punishment.
Because if I just said, Adolf, you killed 6 million Jews. Doesn't matter, you're forgiven.
Is that not what
That's
Jesus...
not justice.
Is that not what Jesus says to Adolf?
No.
Do you not accept that Adolf could potentially, if I can use this language, in quotes, so to speak, do you not accept that Adolf Hitler could actually be saved?
I accept he could have been. I don't know if he was. I very much doubt it, but
we don't know what happened on his deathbed. But
yes, that's true. I accept he could have been.
Do you accept that Adolf could be saved?
Yes.
And therefore, if he was saved, would he be punished?
No, but Christ would have been punished for him.
Thank you.
That's where the atonement. That's where we really disagree. But here's my thing: if you believe that everyone is forgiven, then to me it's a little bit like when my daughter came home from school one time and she said to me, my oldest daughter Becky, who could out-argue me anytime, and she started young, and she came home from school one day and she said to me that, "Dad, I got in trouble." I said, "Why did you get in trouble?" She said, "Well, I argued with the teacher." I said, "What did you do?" And she said, "Well, the teacher said, everyone's special." I said, "And what did you say?" I said, "Miss, if everyone's special, no one's special," which is true. And I think, if you're saying, I think there's a cheap forgiveness. Now, the only way you get away with it is if you say Christ died for everyone and Christ forgives everyone and everyone comes to know Christ. I don't think the scripture teaches that. I don't think Jesus teaches it.
What about the parable of the vineyard workers? They all get paid the same, although they've all done different levels of work.
Yes, but they all came to work.
Some of them just turned up at the last minute.
Yeah, but they still came to work. And
so why is Jesus telling us that parable?
Because he's saying to them, some people, the fact is that they all came to work. Some people were told, you work for a day, you'll get paid this. Other people turned up, you work for an hour, you'll get the same as the ones who work for the day. The ones who work for the day are saying, well, wait a minute, that's not fair, we've worked for a day. He says, well, that's what you agreed to do, it's none of your business. So in effect, he's saying, what's happening to other people is none of your business. I mean, I might turn around and say, Lord, that's not fair. I've been a good free church minister for many years, and there's Alastair the heretic, and he's just waited until he's got, He's just waited, and all of a sudden, he's been converted, and suddenly he's made moderator of the free church or something. I'm going, no, Lord, that's not fair. And then the Lord says, no, you've got your terms, he'll have his.
Okay, so let's keep this focused on Adolf.
I prefer you, but
pretty much our only Quaker systematic theologian, because as Quakers we do unsystematic theology, if you can call it theology, was Robert Barclay of Gordonston, who was a 17th century theologian. And his big issue was the Calvinists, amongst whom he was raised, in what he described as being a form of Calvinism more severe than anything they had in Geneva. His big issue was the idea that there was a division between the damned and the elect, and the limited atonement that follows on from that, etc. So he taught universal salvation, which is founded on what he referred to as being the Quaker text, namely John 1:9, that the light of God is in every one of us. John 1:9. Okay? And so he was basically preaching universal salvation, that anybody, first of all, we don't need to think about heaven and hell as places. I would think of them more as states of consciousness, states of being, as distinct from physical places. There are many mansions in my Father's house. And so Barclay is basically saying the door's open for any who want to walk through it. That heaven or hell are places that we choose. Now, the problem that some Calvinists would have with that statement is that they would say that it is the Arminian heresy. That by exercising choice to enter heaven or not enter heaven, you're contravening the Arminian principle, is that how you describe it? Namely, the view of some Calvinists, of traditional Calvinists, such as many of the ones we grew up amongst, that you can play no part in your own salvation because it's entirely down to God's grace.
Yeah, I think can I just say, I think you're confusing two things.
Okay, yeah.
Because you jumped from universal salvation to the universal free offer of the gospel. So when you say the Quaker text, the true light gives light to every man was coming into the world, John then goes on to say immediately afterwards...
Could you just read us the text, if you got it there?
John was not the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him.
Yeah.
He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God.
Right.
Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God.
Okay,
Now,
so it's that bit about the true light that enlightens every
yes,
person.
but here's the point.
Yep.
The point that John is making is saying, this light has come into the world so that men are without excuse, but they still choose. Ironically, your friend Mr. Barclay is being as fundamentalist in terms of sovereignty as the hyper-Calvinists, because he's saying everyone's saved whether they choose it or not.
Well, I don't think
they have no choice.
He's not actually saying that.
In that case, everyone's not saved, is he?
He's not saying that you are forced to go to heaven.
So is he saying everyone's saved or everyone's not?
But he is saying you have the option.
Yes, so would a Calvinist.
So is that right, really?
Yes. So I would preach here...
Because
the free offer, we would preach the free...
Well, you may preach that here, but not all Calvinists would preach that, would they?
Well, no, we have some people who get an imbalance, and I would call them hyper-Calvinists. But there was a big controversy in Scotland, and there's a book I'd love you to read by a guy called Sinclair Ferguson. He's written a book called The Whole Christ, and I think you will love it. And it's the kind of Calvinism that's empathetic and warm, but in it he's talking about the Marrow Men controversy, in which the Marrow men went round and said, Christ is dead for you.
Yeah.
And they were condemned as heretics, bizarrely, by the liberals in the Church of Scotland.
Bizarrely,
These were the evangelicals. They were condemned by the liberals for being... Now, I think the Marrow...
Boston was condemned by them.
Exactly, and your ancestor, Boston, was one of them.
Yeah.
So, but for me, the beauty about this is this. Jesus came to save the world. He came, and there's a free offer that we give. So I would say to everyone, you come to Christ. You go. Now, the difference between that and universal salvation is, I think, that there are people who will say no. And again, C.S. Lewis put it very well. The Christian is someone who says to God, thy will be done. The person who goes to hell, according to Lewis, is the person to whom God says, thy will be done.
Do you believe that once somebody's banged up in hell, that's a done deed, you're banged up there for all eternity?
I love the way you ask the simple questions. Do you know, I could do the Quaker thing and go, just let me tune into the Spirit a minute.
No, but we're not here for you to do the Quaker thing.
No. Okay, all right, Alastair. Let me answer it.
Can we quick?
It's a fair question, but let me answer it.
We have to watch the time.
We are watching the time. Okay.
Maybe I'll have to get that later train.
These guys said they could talk all night, which I'm sure they could.
Well, how about I answer that one, and then we see if there's any questions for people to ask, and then we'll be done.
I wonder, could we possibly move on to one final point, which is about violence in the cross?
Right. Okay. Can I answer that one first then? Right. There are, as you know, several different views of hell. There are people who say it doesn't exist. Well, they're not following Christ, because nobody taught about hell more than Christ. There are other people who believe that it is eternal, conscious torment for the rest of, there's no time. Yeah. That is the traditional view. I accept that. There are other people who believe that there is a hell, but nobody goes to it except the devil and his angels. And yet there are other people who believe, because of justice and because the soul is not immortal, but we were created mortal, the day you eat of it you will die, and so on, that there are people who go to hell, but at some point it ends for them. So
it ends because you get promoted upstairs?
No, that's it. You're annihilation.
Okay.
So I think I will only go as far as Jesus goes. So for me, it's clear Jesus believed there was a hell. He believed it was a place of punishment, and he came to save people from it. That's where I will go.
Okay. Could I just say briefly where I would go in that, which is I would take the orthodox position, where they say that hell is very deep, but Christ is deeper, and that Christ will wait until the last light is switched off.
Yeah, I know.
And you'll understand where I'm coming from without going into that. Yeah. But I wonder if do the
violence.
Yeah, if we could just come to the violence.
Not just speak about violence, not actually do it.
I mean, very, very briefly, the way I outlined it as a fake theologian in Poacher's Pilgrimage is that we've had two main stages of Christian thought as to what is the cross about. Why, if somebody comes into it, this is a free church. If somebody goes into many other churches in this town, they will see a crucifix. And so supposing a tourist comes in and says, what's that? What do you say to that? Now, the prevailing theology of the first millennium, Christus Victor theology, is that the devil was a ransomer of souls and that the cross represents Christ's victory over the devil. You then had Anselm come in, the Archbishop of Canterbury, put in by the son of William the Conqueror in the 11th century, and he says that gives the devil too much power. Anselm turned it round and said that God is a ransomer of souls, thereby giving us penal substitutionary atonement in Calvinism. I'm simplifying horribly, as I can see from your grimaces. The question that I've got is, given that the reality is that a lot of what ordinary punters out there see is penal substitutionary or equivalent forms of atonement that suggest that the wrath of God is somehow being worked out in the cross. My question is whether we're actually missing the whole point. My question, this is a Quaker question, is whether what happened on the cross is that Jesus manifests the consequences of his non-violence by saying to Pilate, if my kingdom was of this world, my followers would take up arms to come and save me. but my kingdom is not of this world. Why not? Because my kingdom is one of thine kingdom come. Divine justice, divine love come. Thy will be done on earth as is in heaven. And I wonder if we are missing the point that what Jesus does on the cross is that he shows such a depth of love, a love that is prepared to die rather than to kill, that the love in question steps outside of space and time. The love in question is one that hell could not contain. It steps outside of space and time into the realm of eternity, and therefore resurrection is intrinsic to the cross of Christ, because the cross absorbs the violence of the world. And I wonder, is this the kind of, I hesitate to use the word opening because the early Christians perhaps saw it like that, but is this the kind of emphasis that might help us move the Christian insights into the third millennium?
Yes.
Woo.
But
If
you are, Alastair, you are so close. I'm so frustrated.
Close. So close.
Because you are so close.
But.
You have expressed it beautifully, and you've just got the one bit missing.
Which is?
The cross. Now, let me explain why. Okay? Let me explain why. Going back to your history, I don't agree with the history. I think that that's the view that, was it Olin took, the Swedish theologian, about Christus Victor, his book, bringing it back to that. There's no question that the early church did teach the ransom theory, did also teach that Christ was the victor, it was Christ triumphing on the cross. And the Bible teaches that. But what we're calling penal substitutionary atonement.
Could you say?
Yeah, can I explain what that is very briefly? It's Christ. Our sins deserve to be punished. We deserve to go to hell. When Christ dies on the cross, he suffers our hell for us. Now, Karl Barth, who I'm no Barthian, but when he was asked on a train in the United States by a whole bunch of reporters, can you sum up the Christian faith? He said, Jesus loves me, this I know because the Bible tells me so. He also cited an African American who said the Christian faith is this: he dies, I don't die. And I think what you've described is spot on, because you mentioned John. John talked about Christ being the atoning sacrifice for our sins, that turns away the wrath of God. And I think you've described it beautifully. In fact, you've given me an insight, and I'm very grateful to you. I'm genuinely very grateful, because I do think it's outside of time and space. I think it occurs in time and space, but the eternity of hell, Christ suffers on the cross. So when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? At the only point ever, it's as though the Trinity is split. It is the most profound thing. Now, here's the thing. That's not non-violence on one level. I mean, I wouldn't argue Jesus was non-violent anyway when he tipped over the money changer's table. That's a form of violence. And violence is, for me, one of the things in that book, by the way, that you almost convinced me. I almost became a pacifist, because your argument in that is incredibly persuasive. But I think there are other kinds of violence as well. I think there's verbal violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, and so on. I think what Jesus does on the cross is he deals with all the violence. He deals with all the evil. I don't think he could have suffered any more. You know, and when we're talking about limited atonement, we're not saying that Christ could have suffered more if there were more sins piled on him. I think he suffered for the sins of the whole world. And I think that includes all the violence. But it's precisely because God is just and fair, and because that took place outside of space and time, if you like.
But would you still see that as being, would you see it as God punishing Jesus in our stead?
I would see it,
standing in the dock in our place?
I would see it as God destroying our sin, and Paul puts it beautifully. He said, he became sin who knew no sin. So Christ becomes sin. I mean, it's almost blasphemous to say that. There's a sense in which, on the cross, Christ is worse than Hitler, because he becomes sin.
Except he's not, because he is love absorbing that.
Well-
you use the word sin that where I probably use violence.
Yeah.
I think we're using them fairly, I would use them fairly interchangeably.
Well, I'll accept
absorbing
that, yes.
He's absorbing that, isn't he?
Yes, I'll accept the sin and violence, because I would argue that any sin is violence against love, and it's violence against God.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm quite happy to accept that definition.
Yeah.
But I would say this: yes, God so loved that He gave His Son.
Yeah.
Christ went to the cross in love. You know, it's the good old covenant theology that there was a covenant made between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So I think you've got something. But I think it doesn't work if you take away the atonement. So the missing link is the atonement. But I do think you've got something.
I think we could dig much deeper in that.
We could, but we better, yeah.
I think we should give the folks a chance to.
Yeah.
I mean, if I have to, I can get the later train. It's just-
No, we need to go home. I need my tea as
No,
well.
okay,
And
yeah.
we need to. I promised you'd get home. So that's some pretty heavy stuff, by the way. So if you want to ask a nice, simple question.
But it's meaty stuff.
Yeah. Why do Quakers quake? No.
And the thing is, you sit in pretty much any Hebridean croft house, and these are the kind of discussions you can have.
Questions? And I'll bring the mic to you.
Yes.
Yes, sure.
What about people who refuse to come into the light?
Oh, well, that's their choice.
Well, that's what's been said.
Yeah.
They choose.
Well, I think we've
that's
agreed
what
on
I
that.
said,
I think what I've heard tonight is we are in agreement on that. Nobody forces you to enter a heavenly state of consciousness. And what we see in the world is so many people who don't choose that. People who choose greed or aggression instead of love, forgiveness, and so on. And, you end up sitting listening to them speaking about their woes and their unhappiness. And you find yourself thinking, I'm not surprised you're miserable.
Yeah.
Because you're throwing miserableness out. And what goes around comes around.
I forgot something. Just another thing for you to think about. Sorry, when you talked about heaven and hell being states of consciousness.
Yeah. What did you think of that?
Oh, that's so weak. I'm sorry. Listen. In my heaven, I'm going to eat steak. In my heaven,
can I come to your heaven then?
Yeah. There'll be vegans there as well, but
Oh no!
but
No, they're in the other chap's department.
no. But no, what I mean is this. I remember walking along the beach in Brora, and I was a very young. I'd just become a Christian. I was 17 years old. And I remember saying to this older Christian, it was midnight and the moon was shining on the Cromarty Firth. And I said to him, I'm sorry. I said, I don't want to go to heaven. He said, why not? I said, well, I haven't been to Barcelona yet. And I haven't been to Moscow. And I want to go to Moscow. And I haven't been to Beijing. And anyway, I don't want to leave all this behind. This is beautiful. And he laughed at me and he said, David, what do you think heaven is? A state of consciousness? Or do you think it's playing a cloud on a harp? Or do you think, heaven forbid, that's an eternal church service? And I said, yeah, that's pretty well it. And he said, He said, see what this is? And again, this is using C.S. Lewis. This is the Shadowlands. Heaven's the reality. And it's not just a state of consciousness, it's physical. It's a new physics, it's a new biology, it's a new chemistry. But for me, to have heaven as just a state of consciousness...
Not just a state of consciousness.
All right, it's more than that then. Okay.
Where is it, to say to him? Is it coming next week? Is it over here? No, he says. The realm of heaven...
The kingdom is within you. Yes.
Amongst us, is
Yes.
within us, amongst us. The Greek
Yes.
allows quite...
Yes.
The realm of... if we're really switched on, David, we are in heaven right now having this discussion.
Well, we have eternal life now, but we're not in heaven because heaven is a place where there's no pain, suffering, sorrow, sickness, and I'm not in heaven. I live in Dundee, so it's close, but I'm not there.
Well,
I'm
maybe enjoying this more than you are then.
Yeah. Well, no, but you're from Glasgow, so I understand why you think this is heaven. Sorry.
Any more questions? Someone got a question from the floor? If not, I think we'll just...
Did we answer the lady's question properly?
Yes.
Did we answer you properly?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should leave it there. Please hang about. There's some coffee still in the go, and maybe you can give a good round of applause.
Oh, he's never bad, we flee, really.
You know, but poor Alastair, he agrees to come here, and people say to him, "What are you speaking to the wee flea for?"
I know, and then the wee fleas guess what you're speaking to Alastair for.
Well, that's why.
They're going to be very upset if this goes online, David. You know,
I know.
They'll be very upset.
But thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you.